Hello everyone. Tonight we step straight into the deadliest career path of prehistory, being a hunter. Not glamorous, not noble, just a constant flirtation with starvation, infection, and animals that wanted you dead as much as you wanted them roasted. Imagine chasing antelope for 10 hours until you're the one collapsing, smearing beetle poison onto your arrows while praying it doesn't leak into your own bloodstream, or climbing a tree for honey only to fall and become the punchline of campfire jokes. If that already sounds exhausting, well, that's because it was. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this mix of misery and anthropology I keep dragging you into. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's oddly comforting to know who else is awake, learning about poisoned arrows and tragic honey hunts at 2 a.m. Now, soften the room, turn down the lights, maybe sip something warm. Let the hum of your fan or the quiet outside world carry you. We're about to walk barefoot into the dust, where every step could be your last, and every failure is written on an empty stomach. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Forget the balloons, the pastel nurseries, the relatives arguing over who you look like. If you'd been born in a hunting band, instead of a world of spreadsheets and Uber Eats, your first gift wouldn't have been a rattle. It would have been an expectation, not the gentle kind. The kind that presses on your ribs before you've even grown teeth. From the day you squealed your first cry under an open sky, someone was already squinting at you and muttering, "Ah, another mouth to feed. Better hope this one grows up fast." Childhood wasn't a padded sanctuary, it was a training program. You weren't cradled into softness. You were nudged toward flint, wood, and sinew, because your survival ticket depended on the day you could finally bring something bloody back to camp. By the time you were steady enough on your legs, the toys placed in your hands weren't stuffed bears or Lego sets. They were miniature spears, little bows with strings that snapped back into your own eye, and traps that pinched your fingers harder than you'd admit. Every stumble, every bruise, every missed shot at a fleeing lizard wasn't just play. It was a rehearsal for whether you'd one day keep people alive or keep them hungry. And here's the cruel irony. Everyone around you knew that the odds weren't in your favor. Anthropologists have done the math. Hunting, especially in small-scale societies, has a notoriously high failure rate. Up to 70% of the time, hunters returned with nothing. So what does that mean for you? It means growing up with hunger as your tutor, the empty belly as your syllabus. You learned early that when your arrow missed, your people chewed tubers and roots with that blank, chewing in silence look that made you wish you'd aimed straighter. You see, in those camps, being a boy didn't mean you were cute. It meant you were a future provider. And while the women's baskets actually kept everyone alive with dependable plants, berries, and nuts, the prestige, the songs, the rituals, the whispers of "he's becoming a man," all hung on the day you'd drag a carcass across the dirt. That expectation coiled around your little spine like a vine, squeezing before you even knew the difference between hunger and thirst. What you call childhood was closer to an unpaid internship with death. When other children today throw tantrums about broccoli, you would have been handed a stick and told to chase guinea fowl until you collapsed. Crying didn't excuse you. A misstep in a world of thorns and thickets didn't earn sympathy. It earned a lecture about how your clumsy feet might starve your grandmother. Even your playmates, those scrawny cousins with mud-streaked faces, were your competition in training. Whoever threw straighter, tracked quicker, endured longer, he'd be the one whispered about around the fire. So yes, your birth wasn't just celebrated, it was immediately drafted into duty. You weren't a baby, you were an unfinished hunter. And every day you failed to grow toward that role. Someone else had to fill your gap. Someone else's back bent double over digging sticks because you hadn't yet learned to kill. And of course, the joke written in your own bloodline was this: the more everyone expected of you, the more you'd learn that expectation never guaranteed survival. You might have been wrapped in animal hide instead of cotton swaddles, but it wasn't the warmth they hoped for. It was proof you'd someday feed them all. And when hunger has already been your first teacher, what do you think your second one is? So there you are, wobbling through the world with your tiny spear and your oversized duty. And the next thing you discover is that being the future hunter doesn't mean you're actually catching anything. In fact, you're spectacularly bad at it. Every young hunter is. And that's the dirty little truth no one tells you until you've chased your first antelope into the horizon and returned empty-handed. Most of your childhood diet still comes from the baskets of women who roll their eyes at your training. Anthropologists call this the learning curve. You might call it a series of humiliations stitched together by hunger. For years, you'll practice shooting at birds, rabbits, or anything foolish enough to scurry across your path. And for years, your arrows will miss. Your snares will catch nothing but dust. Your stomach will growl like a wild dog, and you'll learn very quickly that hunger doesn't negotiate. There's no bartering with it, no arguing. You eat what others gather, or you don't eat at all. The Hadza boys of Tanzania, for instance, spend years shadowing their elders, trailing behind with small boughs, learning which tracks belong to warthogs and which belong to the goat that wandered too far from camp. They start with lizards, birds, the occasional squirrel. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they don't. What they get consistently is the taste of failure, an acquired flavor. You're forced to swallow long before you taste roasted meat. And this is where hunger becomes your real mentor. It teaches you that every arrow is a gamble. Every chase is an investment of calories you can't afford to waste. Miss too often, and you're burning fuel you can't replace. Which is why hunting isn't glamorous. It's a constant math problem written on your ribs. Even your first successes are suspect. Maybe you kill a tiny bird. You puff out your chest, proud as if you'd downed a buffalo, and everyone in camp smiles politely before tossing it into the stew pot where it disappears without a trace. Your contribution wasn't meat, it was seasoning. That's the apprenticeship. You think you're a provider, but you're still an expense. And while you're busy failing upward, the older hunters remind you, subtly, that your stomach doesn't entitle you to their catch. Among the ache of Paraguay, men hunt large game like peccaries or monkeys, but they don't hoard it, they distribute it through the group. That means, when you're young and unskilled, you eat on their generosity, not your own merit. And nothing makes a growing boy feel hungrier than realizing his life is funded by pity. But here's the cruel twist. The apprenticeship isn't just about missing shots, it's about enduring the silence afterward. Hunger sharpens everything, your vision, your hearing, your desperation. It sits on your chest when you try to sleep. It crawls through your bones when you wake. It whispers, aim straighter, run longer, try harder, and it never stops until you finally, maybe, bring something back. And even then, you'll learn the sick joke of it all. Because the hunger doesn't end with your first kill. No. That's just when the real work starts. Sharpening weapons, preparing poisons, chasing prey that can maim you as easily as feed you. The day you taste your first success is also the day you realize the apprenticeship never actually ends. So you keep following the tracks, your ribs pressing from the inside, your breath hitching in the dry air. And then one day, someone places a heavier bow in your hands and says, now we hunt for real. So now they hand you the real thing, not the toy bows you used to snap against your own ear, but a proper weapon. A bow carved from tough wood, strung with sinew that still smells faintly of animal. And arrows tipped with stone or metal, depending on which century you've stumbled into. And here's the punchline. These are supposed to be the instruments that keep you alive, yet they're just as capable of killing you if you mishandle them. Every hunter knows that tools are fickle companions. Your bowstring snaps at the wrong moment and takes half the skin off your cheek. Your spear shaft splinters, driving a sliver into your palm that festers for weeks. Your trap closes on your own leg because you weren't paying attention. Tools are lifelines, yes, but they're also accidents waiting for an audience, and they're never finished. Nothing is once and done. Every day you're rebinding points with animal sinew, resecuring feathers to shafts, recutting, reoiling, rechecking. A modern office worker complains when their Wi-Fi cuts out. You complained when your bowstring frayed, because that was the difference between eating meat or gnawing another handful of bitter tubers. Some cultures made their weapons into personalities. The sand hunter in southern Africa rubbed poison onto his arrowheads with slow, reverent care, as if whispering secrets into them. The Amazonian hunter shaped his blowpipe with such precision that a single warp in the wood could doom the shot. Each tool wasn't just equipment, It was a little piece of your soul sharpened into wood and bone. And every time you lost one in the underbrush, you lost a piece of yourself, too. And let's not forget that tools are perishable. Stone points chip, wooden shafts warp, sinew cords rot if left in the rain. You don't just own a weapon, you maintain a relationship with it. Like a marriage without the occasional anniversary dinner. Ignore it, and it betrays you when you need it most. Even the simplest things turn into high-stakes chores. Stringing a bow isn't just pulling a cord, it's deciding whether your wrist will still work tomorrow. Setting a trap isn't placing a snare, it's gambling with your own toes. A spear leaning against the wrong tree might slip and jab straight into your thigh. Everything you own in the hunt comes with a warning label, only written in scars instead of ink. And yet, these tools are what give you the thin illusion of control. They're the difference between you and the antelope, between your family eating meat or chewing bark. So you hold on to them, patch them, bless them, curse them, because without them you're just a hungry primate watching dinner run away on 4 legs. But once you've got your bow strung and your arrows tipped, you learn the most brutal fact of all. Weapons don't matter if you can't find anything to shoot at. And that's when you step into the second, more mysterious toolkit. Not wood, not stone, but the art of reading the invisible, the science of tracking. And here's where the real humiliation begins. You've got your shiny bow, your sharp arrows, your calloused hands, and you still don't have a clue where the animals went. Because hunting, at its core, isn't about the weapon, it's about eyes trained to read the ground like a book written in dust, dung, and broken twigs. If you'd been born into the Kalahari wind, instead of into Wi-Fi signals, this would have been your education, following faint hoofprints across baked earth for hours, while an elder muttered corrections at you, like an irritated professor. Too deep, that one was from yesterday. Too wide, that's not antelope, that's cattle. Too close together, see how it limps. You'd miss that, and starve us all. It's an ancient, unpaid internship in humility. The sand hunters are famous for persistence hunting, chasing an antelope literally to collapse by following its prints over sand that looks blank to you but screams stories to them. A heel scuff tells them the animal stumbled. A line of disturbed grass whispers which way it bolted. Even insect movement is a clue. Flies swarm around fresh dung. Beetles circle where hooves broke the soil. To the untrained, it looks like nothing. To a tracker, it's GPS, newsfeed, and dinner menu all at once, and the stakes aren't small. Miss the signs, and you walk 20 kilometers under the sun for nothing. Worse, you waste calories you can't spare, because every failed chase isn't just wasted time, it's your own body eating itself a little more. Tracking is less about animals and more about thermodynamics. How much fuel can you burn before you collapse first? Of course, it's not just antelope hooves you're squinting at. In the forests of the Congo Basin, aka Hunter's Red, how branches bend where dikers slipped past, how spiderwebs tear when bush pigs force through. In the Arctic tundra, Inuit hunters track seals by the tiny ice ridges around breathing holes, waiting motionless for hours until the seal dares to surface. Each environment writes its own alphabet on the land, and you either learn it or you starve. And don't imagine it's romantic. It's not Sherlock Holmes in the sand. It's endless heat, flies in your eyes, cracked lips, knees throbbing, all for the privilege of maybe catching up with an animal that can still outrun you on an empty stomach. The irony of it all is staggering. The animal has 4 legs, you have 2, and your entire survival hinges on convincing your body it can keep going anyway. But that's the cruel genius of persistence hunting. It doesn't matter how fast the antelope is, what matters is heat. Humans sweat. Antelopes don't. If you run long enough under the sun, the animal overheats and collapses. It's not skill that gets you the kill, it's stubbornness. You don't outrun it, you outlast it. The ultimate endurance race, where the prize is meat and the penalty is fainting into the dust. And all the while, you're reading the landscape like scripture. A broken reed, a patch of disturbed soil, a faint smell in the air. They're not details, they're lifelines. Miss one, and you walk back empty-handed, head hung low, another lesson in the long apprenticeship of hunger. But suppose your tracking holds, your legs don't fail, and you finally close in on prey. That's when you face the second cruel joke of the hunter's life. Sometimes, the thing you're chasing is just as eager to chase you back. Here's the part no campfire myth ever brags about. Most hunts end in failure. You imagine hunters swaggering back with carcasses slung across their shoulders. But the truth is uglier and far more common. They come back empty-handed, ribs sharper than pride, eyes refusing to meet anyone else's. Across foraging societies studied by anthropologists, success rates hover depressingly low. The Hadza in Tanzania, a bow drawn 100 times, might bring home meat less than a third of those outings. The ache in Paraguay. Even skilled men return without game most days. Imagine working a job where 7 out of 10 shifts pay nothing, but you still sweat, bleed, and risk your life each time. That's hunting. And here's the sting. Hunger doesn't just punish you. It punishes everyone who depends on you. When the hunt fails, people eat what women gather: berries, roots, tubers, nuts, which, yes, keeps them alive, but doesn't fill the belly in the same way. Meat is high prestige, high protein, high fat, and humans evolved to crave it like a drug. So when you stumble back with nothing but excuses, your failure doesn't just taste like hunger, it tastes like humiliation. The community feels it. Children look at you with those wide eyes that make failure cut deeper. Elders mutter about bad omens, or worse, your incompetence. Women tease you with biting jokes that sting harder than thorns. Ridicule is a social weapon, after all. In the Inuit Arctic, missing a seal might mean everyone eats dried fish scraps instead of fresh meat. In the Kalahari, missing an antelope might mean another day gnawing fibrous tubers that scrape your throat like sandpaper. Failure is never private, and failure carries risk beyond shame. When you've burned thousands of calories chasing an animal that outruns you, your body isn't just disappointed, it's in debt. Hunting is an energy gamble. The return on investment has to exceed what you've burned, or you're literally starving yourself with every step. A persistence hunt in blistering heat might cost you more than you'll ever gain if you come back with nothing. It's the biological equivalent of maxing out a credit card you can't repay. The cruelest part: success doesn't balance the scales for long. Even a large kill disappears quickly once the camp feasts. A kudu or a wild pig, stripped, roasted, shared, and gone within days. Then it's back to failure again, back to hunger pacing at your side like an impatient dog. And that constant cycle does something to your head. Every step you take into the bush isn't just about the possibility of meat, it's about the looming threat of returning empty. It builds paranoia, obsession, superstition. Maybe you wore the wrong amulet today. Maybe the spirits of the animals are mocking you. Maybe that cough you had yesterday scared the prey away. Anything to explain the silence of your bow. Because hunger isn't just emptiness, it's a judgment. And in the world of hunters, every empty hand is another mark against you. And suppose you do finally succeed. Suppose your arrow strikes true. That's when you realize success carries its own risks. Because some prey don't go quietly into your stew pot. Some fight back. So picture it: you've tracked all day. Your tongue is dry. Your stomach is folding in on itself. And finally you see it: a wild boar rooting in the underbrush. A buffalo staring at you through lashes thick with flies. Or maybe an elephant grazing at the edge of the forest. And here's the cruel reality: you're the one with the bow, but they're the ones holding the higher odds. Dangerous prey has a way of reminding hunters that they're not apex predators, just fragile bipeds with inflated egos. Wild boars, for instance, are legendary for goring hunters. A single charge and you're down, tusks carving through your thigh like a plow through dirt. Buffalo, they're basically horned battering rams wrapped in 2 tons of bad attitude. And elephants, well, some hunters in East Africa risk their lives with nothing but spears, aiming for soft spots, while knowing that one wrong step meant a stomped ribcage and a fast obituary. And yet, these animals were targeted because of what they offered: fat, meat, hides, prestige. Risk equals reward, but the math never looked good up close. The ache hunters in Paraguay, for instance, killed peccaries, aggressive, sharp-tusked pigs that travel in herds. Miss your shot, and you weren't looking at dinner. You were looking at being swarmed by 30 angry animals who weren't impressed by your apprenticeship in hunger. This isn't limited to forests or savannas. Arctic hunters chasing seals sometimes faced polar bears instead, and the Inuit don't romanticize those encounters. A bear doesn't care if you're divine in your clan or if your people need meat. It just cares that you look crunchy. And predators weren't even the worst. Sometimes it was the prey itself, the ones humans imagine as harmless grazers. Cape buffalo have earned the nickname Black Death for their tendency to ambush hunters long after being wounded. Even giraffes have kicked men to death when cornered. There's something profoundly humbling about realizing that your future as a provider might be ended by a long-necked herbivore with bad aim. Weapons don't solve the fear either. A spear gives you reach, yes, but it also ties you to the animal's fury the second it lands. A bow lets you stand back, but not far enough if the beast charges faster than you can reload, and blowpipes, effective for small prey, but laughable against a tusked monster that doesn't even notice the dart before trampling you. So every hunt of dangerous prey was also a flirtation with your own mortality. Success meant prestige, fat sizzling in the fire, children gnawing bones and singing your name. Failure meant blood on the dirt, possibly yours, possibly shared with the unlucky cousin who thought standing closer would help. And this constant gamble carved itself into hunting culture. Songs and rituals weren't just decoration, they were psychological armor. Hunters spoke to the spirits of animals, asked permission, and begged forgiveness. Because deep down, everyone knew the truth. The prey didn't want to be hunted, and it had every tool to prove it. But sometimes the danger didn't come charging at you on four legs. Sometimes it seeped slowly into your veins, invisible, carefully prepared by your own hands. That's when poison entered the picture, both salvation and silent threat. If you thought dangerous prey was bad, wait until you meet your real hunting partner, poison. Because at some point, humans realized that chasing antelope for 6 hours was exhausting, and sticking venom on your arrows did the job faster. Brilliant idea, right? Except poison doesn't come with a safety manual, it comes with the risk that one slips away from turning you into your own prey. Take the sand hunters of southern Africa. They use a beetle larva, Diamphidia, whose innards ooze a slow-acting toxin. Hunters squeeze it onto arrow shafts, let it dry, and voila, one scratch on the prey and the poison does the rest. Elegant in theory, but here's the catch. Get that liquid in a cut on your own hand, and you'll be wobbling into the afterlife long before the antelope does. It's the culinary equivalent of seasoning dinner with arsenic and hoping you don't lick your fingers. Or the Amazonian hunters with their famous It's a plant-based brew, ground vines, sometimes mixed with other ingredients, painted onto blowpipe darts. A single dart could paralyze a monkey within minutes. Fantastic for hunting in the canopy, terrible if you jab yourself while loading. Curare shuts down muscles, including the ones you use for breathing, which means the only lesson carved into your funeral mask would read, couldn't keep track of which end was which. Every poison has its quirks. Some act fast, dropping animals within minutes, which is handy if you don't feel like hiking 20 kilometers to collect your dinner. Others act slow, which is less fun because it means you track a staggering antelope for hours while praying the vultures don't get to it first. Either way, you're stuck in the middle, exhausted, hungry, and covered in sweat, trailing death you yourself might catch. And preparation isn't casual. It's ritual, detail, obsession. Hunters often pass recipes down through generations, each ingredient memorized with the precision of a family secret. Some ingredients are boiled, others smoked, some smeared on carefully with sticks so your skin never touches them. It's chemistry without lab coats, and mistakes aren't forgiven. But here's the real irony. Poison makes hunting possible in places where failure would otherwise be guaranteed. Yet it also makes hunters' lives even riskier. You live in a world where every arrowhead could be your own undoing, where a small cut, a moment of carelessness, turns into convulsions on the dirt. You're not just carrying weapons, you're carrying death in liquid form, balanced delicately between the prey's bloodstream and your own. And this delicate dance seeps into the stories. Hunters sing to their arrows, whispering for them to strike cleanly, not to wander astray, not to prick the wrong skin. Because in truth, every hunt is a gamble with invisible dice. Sometimes the prey dies, sometimes you die, and sometimes both. But poison isn't the only invisible enemy you carry with you. Even if the arrow flies true, even if the poison works, you're still left with wounds, scratches, and bites from the land itself. And the land is generous with infection. You'd think the worst thing about being a hunter was the prey itself. The tusks, the horns, the angry stampedes. But no, it's the little things that really get you. A thorn, a scratch, a mosquito bite, a cut from your own blade. Small insults that turn into slow executions. Because infection doesn't roar or charge, it festers, quietly, until your body can't keep up. Imagine walking barefoot for hours through thorn scrub. One sharp acacia spine slices your foot. It's nothing at first. You suck the blood, maybe spit on it, and keep going. But days later it swells, turns red, oozes pus. There's no penicillin, no neat little tube of antiseptic cream. There's only herbal poultices that sometimes help and sometimes don't, and the quiet knowledge that a single thorn might cost you your leg or your life. Snake bites were another occupational hazard. Tropical hunters knew the patterns of venomous snakes better than most modern doctors, because one careless step on a log could mean hours of pain before death. And if the bite didn't kill you outright, infection might. Skin turning black, muscles rotting from the inside out. Lovely souvenirs of the hunt. Then there are parasites, invisible passengers gifted to you by the land. In the Amazon, hookworms slip through bare skin. Schistosomias lurks in rivers where you wade to check traps. Malaria hums in your blood after one unlucky mosquito. In Central Africa, tsetse flies deliver sleeping sickness, knocking you into fevers and delirium. And the cruel irony, you weren't even hunting them, they were hunting you. Even the prey itself could poison you beyond arrows. Butchering an animal carried risks. In parts of East Africa, hunters who cut into raw carcasses might contract anthrax or brucellosis. A small wound mixed with animal blood was enough to bring days of fever, weakness, sometimes death. And there's no worse punchline than dying from a meal you didn't even get to eat. The environment wasn't shy about offering hazards either. A fall during a pursuit could leave you with broken bones that never healed right. Infections set in when bone pierced skin. Without hospitals, recovery often meant lifelong limping, if you were lucky enough to survive at all. What really makes this bleakly funny, in the way that makes you laugh and wince at once, is how much knowledge hunters built to fight these invisible threats. Herbal remedies, smoke treatments, rituals that blended medicine with prayer. A leaf poultice for wounds, resins burned to keep mosquitoes at bay, chewing certain barks for fevers. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it was theater, and sometimes the cure was as risky as the disease. So hunting wasn't just about bringing home meat, it was about surviving your own mistakes, surviving the land's sharpness, and surviving the microscopic assassins you couldn't even see. You didn't just wrestle antelope, you wrestled bacteria, and more often than not, the bacteria won. And if infection didn't take you, exhaustion was waiting right behind it, because no matter how careful you were, the hunt itself demanded more from your body than most bodies could give. Let me ruin the romance of it for you. Hunting wasn't some heroic sprint with a dramatic kill at the end. It was hours, sometimes days of running, crawling, and sweating your soul out under skies that never cared if you collapsed. The body of a hunter wasn't sculpted by gym mirrors, it was whittled down by necessity. Ribs like tally marks, calves shaped by survival's cruel mathematics. Take persistence hunting in the Kalahari. Imagine setting out after dawn, chasing an antelope that bolts at the first sniff of your sweat. It sprints, you jog, it stops, you track. The cycle repeats for 6, 8, 10 hours. By noon the heat is blinding, the ground shimmering, and you're still running. Not sprinting, running like a machine that can't afford to break down. Because your one evolutionary advantage, the thing nature handed you in exchange for hairless skin and embarrassing fragility, is sweating. You can outlast the antelope by cooking it from the inside. Congratulations, your divine gift is being a slow, naked oven. And if you think this was just Africa, think again. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters hauled themselves across endless ice, dragging sleds, holding spears, waiting motionless at sealed breathing holes for hours. Try sitting absolutely still in sub-zero temperatures, your body shivering so hard your teeth sound like percussion instruments, and tell me that's not an Olympic-level ordeal. Calories ruled everything. One study of the Hadza showed that men might walk 15 to 20 kilometers a day hunting, often with no guarantee of meat at the end. That's the cruel arithmetic. You burn more energy than you replace. Every step of the hunt is a gamble with your own reserves. Burn too much, get too little, and you're spiraling into starvation. Your joints, your muscles, your lungs, all of them learned to live at the edge of collapse. And there's no mercy. A twisted ankle isn't just inconvenient. It could mean no food for your family. A day of exhaustion isn't just fatigue. It's a day of shame when everyone else chews roots and looks at you like you're already a ghost. And hunger only makes it worse. Try running on an empty stomach. carrying nothing but the gnawing ache of yesterday's missed catch. Hunger isn't fuel. Hunger is an anchor. It drags at your legs, fuzzes your thoughts, makes every shadow look like an enemy. But you keep running anyway, because stopping isn't an option when the only thing between you and death is whether your persistence outlasts the praise. And then there's the environment itself. The Amazon's humidity clings to your skin like a wet blanket, turning every step into suffocation. The savanna scorches you with sun, and scorches you again with reflected heat from the ground. The forest canopy cuts you with vines, scrapes you with bark, bruises you with hidden roots. The hunt wasn't just against animals. It was against the land, the weather, and your own body breaking under pressure. And here's the kicker. Even if you succeeded, even if you staggered home with meat slung over your shoulders, you weren't rewarded with rest. You were rewarded with expectation. Because the community didn't just want food, they wanted proof that you were strong enough, determined enough, and worthy of the prestige that clung to successful hunters like smoke clings to skin. And that's where the exhaustion twisted into something worse. Social pressure. Because the kill wasn't just meat, it was your reputation, your marriage prospects, your status around the fire. So imagine it, after days of chasing dust, sweating until your skin tastes like salt, you finally bring something back. A carcass dripping onto your shoulders, flies buzzing like applause, and suddenly, you're not just the hungry one anymore, you're the provider, the man of the hour, the camp's walking headline. Congratulations, you've gone from invisible to indispensable. But don't smile yet, because prestige is a currency that inflates and collapses quicker than you think. Across foraging societies, from the Hadza in East Africa to the Inuit in the Arctic, hunting success wasn't just calories on the fire. It was social capital. Bring home meat, and you earn songs, stories, and the sideways glances of potential wives. Fail too often, and you get jokes sharp enough to cut deeper than any spear. The ache of Paraguay had a reputation for teasing unsuccessful hunters until their ears burned red. It wasn't cruelty, it was regulation. Humiliation kept the standards high. But here's the dark humor of it. Even when you succeed, you don't get to keep the prize. Meat in hunter-gatherer societies is shared. You can spend days chasing a kudu until your knees collapse, drag it back half-dead with triumph, and by nightfall it's distributed across camp. Everyone eats. You eat too, but not more, not better. Your glory lasts in stories, not in your stomach, and people don't even let you brag. Among the Kungsan hunters practice insulting the meat, deliberately downplaying their catch, bring back a fat eland, and the group says, "That scrawny thing, barely worth cooking." It's a cultural tactic to prevent arrogance, to remind you that pride makes bad hunters. So you sit there, nodding, pretending the animal on the fire isn't the biggest kill of the season, while everyone chews and quietly acknowledges your worth. Marriage, that's tied up in it too. Women noticed who consistently brought home meat. A skilled hunter had more options, more alliances, more children, but prestige was fragile. One unlucky year of failure, and suddenly that reputation crumbled. You weren't just hungry, you were less desirable, less trusted, less powerful, and prestige was dangerous because it brought envy. A man who hunted well could become too visible, too respected. Others might mutter about him, suspect him of sorcery, or accuse him of greed. In tight-knit groups, standing too tall was as risky as stumbling too low. You were expected to succeed, but never flaunt it, provide, but never boast, be admired, but never envied. A balancing act worthy of its own tragedy. So hunting wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was emotional tightrope walking. Success meant respect, but also scrutiny. Failure meant ridicule, but also survival on someone else's generosity. And every arrow you lost was aimed not just at an animal, but at your own reputation, your own standing in the camp's delicate web of gossip, alliances, and grudges. Because in the end, being a hunter wasn't simply about feeding people. It was about proving again and again, with every step, every shot, every bead of sweat, that you deserved a right to stand among them at all. And once the meat was eaten, once the jokes were made, there was another layer still pressing on your ribs. Hunting wasn't only about calories and reputation. It was tied into the unseen, the sacred, the spirits that watched every kill and whispered judgment in the silence of the bush. You might think hunting was just sweat and sinew, but to the people who lived by it, there was always someone else in the room or in the bush, or the sky, or lurking in the carcass itself. Because killing wasn't just killing. It was spiritual politics. You weren't just taking an animal's life. You were messing with cosmic balances. And balances are notoriously unforgiving when you ignore them. Among the San of southern Africa, hunters would speak directly to the antelope they killed, apologizing, even caressing the body, whispering that its death was necessary. It wasn't sentimental. It was survival insurance. Because animals had spirits, and spirits remembered. If you were careless, boastful, or disrespectful, the next antelope might make sure your arrow missed, or worse, ensure that tusks found your ribs before you found its heart. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters followed similar lines. A seal wasn't just meat. It was a being who had to be honored. If you didn't sprinkle fresh water into its mouth after killing it, its spirit could return angry, refusing to let other seals appear at their breathing holes. Forget that step, and suddenly the ice was empty, the hunger heavy. A simple ritual, a handful of water, stood between you and famine. The Amazon was no different. Hunters among the Matses and other groups believed the forest itself watched, punishing greed or disrespect. Too many kills in a row, and you weren't admired, you were cursed. Spirits of the prey might retaliate with illness, accidents, or barren hunts. Even jaguars, apex predators in their own right, were imagined as shamans' companions, spirits in fur who could return human arrogance with claws. And the rituals weren't just about keeping animals happy. They were about keeping humans humble. Feasts and dances often followed hunts, not just to eat, but to reset the moral balance. To remind everyone that meat wasn't taken, it was given by spirits, by gods, by the land. Failed to acknowledge that gift, and you weren't just unlucky. You were inviting collapse, famine, disease. It sounds poetic until you realize the pragmatic truth. Treating the animal as sacred keeps hunters cautious. If you believed the antelope was watching you from the afterlife, you didn't waste its body. You didn't kill more than you needed. You didn't swagger too much at the fire. The spirituality doubled as ecology. Respect rituals became a survival manual dressed up as theology. But for the hunter himself, the effect was heavier. Every shot carried spiritual weight. Every failure wasn't just bad aim. It might have been punishment for a forgotten song, an unspoken prayer, a ritual skipped when you were too tired. You weren't just hunting antelope. You were being hunted by expectation, guilt, and the unseen ledger of the spirit world. And if spirits could punish you for disrespect, humans could punish you for something even more immediate, stepping onto the wrong land, into the wrong territory, where other hunters were waiting with sharper arrows than yours. You might think the hunt ended once you'd faced the antelope or the boar, but the most unpredictable danger wasn't always on 4 legs. It was on 2, and it spoke your language. Other hunters, other bands, other groups, all of them just as hungry, just as desperate, and often more than willing to turn you into the prey if it meant access to game-rich land. Territory is never just space, it's survival. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, hunting bands ranged across dry savannas, but they also knew the invisible borders of other groups. Cross those lines, and you weren't seen as a neighbor, you were an intruder. And in a world where calories meant life, intruders weren't politely escorted out. They were ambushed, robbed, sometimes killed outright. Amazonian groups had their own bloody traditions. The Yanomami, for instance, were notorious for intergroup raids, often sparked by disputes over women or hunting territory. A hunt that took you too far from home might end not with a kill, but with arrows raining from the trees. Step into the wrong forest, and suddenly your prize peccary wasn't the danger, it was the men waiting behind it. Camouflaged and armed, their hunger sharpened into hostility. And it wasn't just enemies, even alliances could be fragile. Shared hunts meant shared kills, but also disputes. Who shot the arrow first? Who deserves the best cuts of meat? Anthropologists recorded arguments spiraling into violence over nothing more than who owned the right to boast. Because in hunter-gatherer worlds, prestige was meat, and meat was life. Think the Arctic spared you. Hardly. Inuit bands had to negotiate access to seal holes, caribou migration paths, and fishing waters. Step into another band's hunting ground without permission, and you risked being seen as a thief. And in places where survival balanced on a knife's edge, thieves weren't tolerated. The tragic comedy of it all is that the hunter, supposedly the provider, was always one mistake away from becoming a casualty in the human Hunger Games. You left camp to feed your people and ended up feeding the gossip of another camp. Did you hear? He wandered where he shouldn't. They found his bow, but not him. Even within your own band, things weren't always safe. Competition simmered beneath the surface. One man's repeated success could breed resentment, whispered accusations of hoarding, of greed, of breaking taboos. In small societies, envy had teeth. Hunters could find themselves isolated, targeted, or even ritually punished for upsetting the delicate balance of equality. So the hunt wasn't just against the land and the animals. It was against other humans who measured your worth, policed your borders, and sharpened their arrows while you stumbled after your own prey. And yet, for all the dangers that walked upright, you couldn't escape the hazards that lurked in silence. Sometimes death didn't come from a charging buffalo or a rivaled spear. Sometimes it came from a misstep, a slip, a fall, accidents written into the very ground you walked on. The land itself was never neutral. Every step carried risk, and not always the glamorous kind you could turn into a fireside story. Sometimes it wasn't a duel with a charging boar or a brush with a jaguar. Sometimes it was slipping, falling, or getting tangled in your own trap. And those accidents killed just as effectively as tusks and claws. Take honey hunting, for example. Foragers across Africa and Asia risked their lives climbing trees to harvest wild honey. The Hadza in Tanzania scaled baobabs with nothing but rough pegs jammed into the bark, smoke bundles strapped to their belts to calm angry bees. Miss one step, lose your grip, and you didn't die as a hero. You died as a cautionary tale. Remember him. Fell out of a tree for honey. Sweetness becomes epitaph. River crossings were another lottery. Following games often meant wading through water churning with unseen hazards. A misstep on slick rocks, and suddenly you were dragged under. Drownings weren't rare, especially when hunters carried heavy loads or weapons. And that's not even counting crocodiles, who treated a struggling human as a convenient takeout. Traps, those clever devices meant for prey, had no loyalty. Snares snapped on your own ankle, tightening until you screamed. Deadfall traps didn't care if you were a gazelle or the fool who set them. Even blowpipes misfired, shooting poison darts into the hand of the hunter who carved them. A tool meant for survival could pivot into executioner with terrifying speed, and the terrain itself had teeth. In the Amazon, hunters cut themselves daily on thorns, slipped in mud that swallowed legs to the knee, fell across sharp roots that tore skin open. In the savannah, you could trip on invisible burrows and twist your ankle 3 hours from camp, which meant limping back while vultures circled overhead like they'd already heard the ending. In the Arctic, cracked the wrong ice sheet, and you didn't just fall, you vanished into freezing water, swallowed before your hunting partners could even shout your name. And here's the eerie part. These accidents weren't dramatic enough to earn songs or rituals. They were just quiet failures. No glory, no animal spirit to blame, no heroic struggle. Just a misstep, a slip, a cut that wouldn't heal. Hunters lived with the knowledge that the land didn't need malice to kill them. Indifference was more than enough. But in every culture, knowledge accumulated like scar tissue. The elders taught, don't climb after rain, test the ice with your spear, don't walk barefoot near that tree. Survival became a list of rules whispered. Generation after generation, rules carved out of the bodies of those who ignored them. And still, no hunter ever stopped taking risks, because danger was part of the bargain. You couldn't feed your family, your camp, or yourself without leaning into the possibility that one wrong step meant never coming back. But the only thing sharper than the thorns and slipperier than the river rocks was knowledge itself, inherited, memorized, and recited like scripture, because every near-death became a lesson, every scar a paragraph in a living encyclopedia. Every cut, every fall, every failed hunt left a lesson, and those lessons didn't just die with the unlucky. They were passed down like heirlooms, sharper than blades, heavier than spears. You weren't born knowing which vine brewed poison, which tracks led to water, or which berries made your stomach cramp until you prayed for death. That knowledge was inherited, pressed into you by elders who carried libraries in their heads instead of bookshelves in their huts. Think about it. The sand trackers of the Kalahari could identify 30 different hoofprints at a glance. Which species, how old, how fast it was moving. That wasn't intuition. It was training hammered into them from childhood. Repetition until the sand itself seemed to talk. The Inuit learned from elders where seal holes would form in ice, where caribou might cross rivers, and how to read the sky for subtle weather shifts. Miss one lesson, ignore one warning, and the cost wasn't a bad grade, it was starvation. This knowledge wasn't optional. It was mandatory software installed in your brain through endless storytelling, demonstration, and yes, ridicule. Around the fire, hunters didn't just brag about kills. They recited mistakes. Remember when he stepped on the rotten log and broke his leg? Don't do that. Remember when she ate the wrong mushroom? Don't do that either. Your education was a curriculum of disasters. Even plants, your invisible allies and enemies, were catalogued through generations. Which roots drew out infection, which barks soothed fever, which leaves sealed wounds. The AKA and Baka in Central Africa, for example, can list hundreds of medicinal plants without hesitation. That wasn't trivia, that was survival. Because when you're 3 days into the forest with a festering cut, you either know the right bark to chew or you rot. And the knowledge wasn't just technical, it was spiritual too. Which animals demanded apologies, which demanded offerings, which demanded silence. Because if you ignored those rituals, the elders said, you'd scare the prey away for weeks. Was that literally true? Maybe not. But the effect was the same. Rituals disciplined the hunter, kept greed in check, and reinforced humility. Knowledge wasn't just about how to kill. It was about how not to ruin the hunt for everyone else. The irony is, the more you knew, the heavier the burden became. You didn't just carry a bow and a quiver. You carried centuries of observation, myths, taboos, superstitions, and hard-earned truths. Forget one detail, and you'd be remembered as the fool whose ignorance cost the camp its meal. So when you set out, you weren't alone. You walked with the ghosts of all the hunters who came before you, their mistakes carved into the way you held your bow, their warnings muttered in your head as you tested the ground. Your survival was never yours alone. It was borrowed knowledge, rented wisdom, kept alive through endless retelling. But even inherited knowledge couldn't rewrite the final fact. Hunters died young, often suddenly, and always under pressure. Mortality stalked them as closely as they stalked their prey. Here's the truth, no myth song likes to sing too loudly. Hunters died, not just sometimes, often. The job description came with a short lifespan and a long list of ways to exit early gored. Trampled, poisoned, drowned, starved, or simply worn down until your body gave up mid-step. Adult male mortality in many foraging groups was significantly higher than among their female counterparts. The spear was never just a tool. It was a countdown clock. Among the ache of Paraguay, researchers recorded high rates of violent death among men, hunting injuries, falls, animal attacks. Among the San, persistent hunts could end in collapse from heatstroke, especially when young men overestimated their stamina. In the Arctic, a misjudged ice edge or an encounter with a polar bear could erase your name from memory in minutes. Everywhere you look, the job of feeding people doubled as a death lottery. But death in hunting cultures wasn't meaningless. Each loss carved itself into the memory of the group. Names were remembered in stories, retold at fires, woven into ritual chants. A hunter's failure became a warning, his bravery became a model, his scars became folklore after he was gone. You didn't die quietly. You were absorbed into the knowledge bank of the living. And even the spirits of the animals you hunted were said to remember you. Some San believed the antelope's soul carried messages to the spirit world, a kind of cosmic ledger of your behavior. Among Arctic groups, seals and whales were thought to report back to their kin whether hunters were respectful. In other words, your legacy wasn't just in human mouths, but in the mouths of the very prey you pursued. Still, the most enduring legacy was cultural. The child watching you stumble back empty-handed learned hunger's bite. The one who watched you collapse under heat learned caution. The one who saw your success learned how prestige shines and fades. Your life was a lesson plan written in blood and sweat. And when you died, the syllabus didn't end, it shifted hands. And here's the paradox. For all its risk, hunting remained central to identity. Even when gathering provided most of the calories, the hunter was mythologized. The provider, the brave one, the figure whose work kept spirits appeased and stomachs filled. Death didn't erase that. If anything, it exaggerated it. Stories polished away the hunger, the infections, the humiliations, leaving behind the gleam of heroism. But behind the polish was the darker truth. Being a hunter was less about power and more about sacrifice. You gave your body to the chase, your safety to the kill, your years to a role that was as much burden as glory. And if you were lucky, your legacy wasn't just meat consumed, but knowledge remembered, rituals preserved. and your name murmured long after your bones joined the dust. Because in the end, that's what being a hunter meant. Not victory, not trophies, not eternal prestige. It meant being part of a cycle that chewed through bodies but preserved memory, where your death was just another lesson in the endless school of survival. Long before cookbooks, calorie charts, and the occasional celebrity chef scandal, eating was a gamble with mortality. The human menu wasn't curated, it was improvised. The forest floor, the riverbank, the termite mound, all of them were markets where every item came without a label. A root dug from the soil could be dinner or disaster. A mushroom might open the mind or shut down the liver. And insects, buzzing with promise, might fill the stomach with protein or line it with parasites. This was the original culinary experiment, and the stakes were higher than taste. Trial and error wasn't a metaphor, it was a system. One person chewed a new root, waited to see if the bitterness faded or if their tongue went numb, and the rest of the group learned from the outcome. Survival knowledge spread mouth to mouth, literally, across generations. Oral traditions didn't just carry myths, they carried antidotes, warnings, and a quiet list of names of the people who tested the recipe wrong. There was nothing romantic about it. Hunger was relentless. It pressed people into trying things that smelled strange, looked suspicious, or squirmed in the hand. And with no modern tools to analyze toxins, the body itself became the lab. Sweats, vomiting, convulsions, all feedback mechanisms in the prehistoric science of food testing. Death, unfortunately, was also a form of peer review. Yet this chaos shaped cultures. The ache of Paraguay knew which bitter manioc roots could be eaten only after days of soaking and grinding. The Hadza of Tanzania distinguished edible tubers from their poisonous cousins by subtle differences in taste and texture. And across the Arctic, people identified safe lichens through centuries of trial, while ignoring the ones that killed sled dogs. These were not instincts, but archives of inherited mistakes. Eating was never innocent. Every bite came with the question, is this sustenance, or is this poison cleverly disguised as lunch? The prehistoric table was set with uncertainty, and uncertainty became a way of life. And under the soil, another lesson waited, that the roots sustaining entire communities could also carry toxins sharp enough to paralyze or kill, unless humans invented ways to tame them. Beneath the soil lay both salvation and sabotage. Roots and tubers became staples for foragers across continents, dense with starch, easy to dig, and impossible to ignore. They were the prehistoric equivalent of emergency rations, filling, transportable, and always hiding in the ground. But the earth is a trickster. For every yam that saved a family from famine, there was another root waiting to choke the nervous system or coat the blood with toxins. Take cassava, for example, the tuber that would later become the backbone of diets in South America, Africa, and beyond. Raw and untreated, it carries cyanogenic glycosides, chemical compounds that, when chewed, release cyanide. A single mistake in preparation could mean convulsions, paralysis, or death. Yet communities learned to grind, soak, and ferment cassava until the poison leached away, leaving calories instead of corpses. The labor wasn't optional. It was survival choreography. Other roots carried their own hazards. Cycad seeds, eaten in parts of Oceania, required repeated washing to remove neurotoxins. Some wild yams held alkaloids strong enough to induce hallucinations or heart failure. And in temperate regions, even seemingly harmless bulbs sometimes concealed chemicals that burned throats or shut down kidneys. To the untrained eye, one tuber looked much like another, which made the margin of error painfully thin. Preparation methods became culture. Grinding stones, leaching pits, fermentation jars. These weren't just tools, they were safeguards, physical reminders that nature's generosity always came with small print. And the rituals around food weren't superstition. They were insurance policies encoded in song and repetition. Children learned early that impatience with roots could kill them faster than hunger itself. But for all the risk, roots remained irresistible. In lean seasons, when hunting failed and fruits were scarce, they were the underground bank account, a deposit of calories hidden beneath dust or mud. Digging with sticks or bare hands, people pulled out knobby tubers that might stretch a family through another week. And always, in the back of their minds, lingered the knowledge that one mistake in selection or preparation could undo them. The earth offered food, but never freely. Every bite of a root was a contract. Labor first, patience next, survival maybe. And if the soil could deceive with starch, the forest floor was an even more elaborate stage, littered with mushrooms that looked like invitations but often turned into funerals. Nature isn't generous, it's vindictive. Plants don't sit passively in the soil waiting to be eaten. They defend themselves with chemistry, invisible barbs that punish the tongue, the gut, and sometimes the brain. Humans learned this the hard way, discovering that bitterness wasn't just a flavor but often a warning label written in alkaloids and cyanide. Alkaloids, the plant's equivalent of a bar fight, appear in species across the globe. Some simply made the mouth pucker, teaching foragers that the tuber wasn't worth the effort. Others went further: convulsions, nausea, hallucinations, even respiratory failure. Wild yams and certain beans carried enough chemical sting to turn a meal into a medical crisis. The lesson was clear: taste, bitterness, proceed with caution. But hunger doesn't care about caution. Hunger pushes people to chew anyway, then invent detoxification rituals later. Cyanogenic plants were even crueler. Cassava, still central to diets for hundreds of millions today, hid cyanide behind its bland taste. Raw consumption could leave a person dizzy, paralyzed, or dead. Long-term reliance on poorly processed cassava has been linked to neurological diseases, especially in regions where famine made shortcuts unavoidable. It was food that was nourished and poisoned in the same bite. This was the paradox humans wrestled with. The most reliable staples were often the most dangerous. Communities responded with laborious preparation, pounding, soaking, leaching, fermenting. The Ache in South America ground and soaked bitter manioc in rivers for days, letting the poison drift downstream. In Africa, women fermented roots into pastes or beers, the bubbles of fermentation a sign that the toxins had finally relaxed their grip. The chemistry was brutal but not arbitrary. Plants evolved toxins to discourage predators, to make sure roots weren't eaten into extinction. Humans evolved stubbornness. Trial after fatal trial, people discovered that poison could be tamed, that what began as a lethal bite could, with enough effort, become a staple. The price was eternal vigilance. And so every root and seed came with a question: how much labor will it take to make this safe? And how many people must suffer before we learn the method? Oral tradition became a ledger of chemical mistakes. Children didn't just inherit stories of heroes, they inherited stories of cousins who ate the wrong yam and never woke up. But if the ground was treacherous, the surface was worse. Scattered across grass and forest floors were fungi, delicate umbrellas of flesh that concealed destinies ranging from visions to vomiting to slow, organ-rotting deaths. Few foods test human optimism like mushrooms. Soft, spongy, often beautiful, they invite you to pluck and taste. And yet, tucked behind those fragile caps, lies a spectrum of outcomes: nourishment, visions, or the kind of liver failure that writes its own obituary in a matter of days. The problem has always been deception. Edible mushrooms often look eerily like their poisonous cousins. A chanterelle can be mistaken for its toxic double. an edible field mushroom confused with Amanita phthoides, the death cap. The difference between dinner and disaster might be a subtle color shift on the gills, a smell only an elder's memory can place, or a test performed with trembling fingers. Cultures learned to walk this line with caution. In Europe, folklore swelled with rules: peel the skin, boil with silver, watch for discoloration. Most of these rules were useless, but they gave people the illusion of control. In a world where fungi were killed quietly, Siberian shamans, by contrast, leaned into the risk. Amanita muscaria, with its iconic red cap and white speckles, wasn't just tolerated but revered, consumed for trance, visions, and the supposed ability to converse with spirits. Vomiting and convulsions were considered part of the experience initiation by toxin. In Mesoamerica, mushrooms occupied another role altogether. Certain species, later called Tiananacatl, or flesh of the gods, were eaten in ritual ceremonies that blurred the line between religion and pharmacology. They weren't food so much as portals, inducing visions that reshaped cosmologies. Here, poisoning wasn't an accident, it was a controlled descent into altered consciousness. But the forest was still ruthless. Across the world, families remembered who ate the wrong fungi. Symptoms could be grotesque: profuse sweating, delirium, seizures, then the slow, grinding failure of kidneys and liver. Death could take hours or days, long enough for observers to learn the lesson and pass it on. Mushrooms were never neutral. They were tests, and humans survived by cataloging failure. The ambiguity of fungi reinforced the role of elders as living encyclopedias. A child's curiosity could kill, but a grandmother's memory, which caps were safe, which stalks smelled wrong, which patches of ground concealed hidden killers, kept entire camps alive. The knowledge was fragile, vulnerable to forgetting, which is why myths and taboos crystallized around it. Some mushrooms weren't just bad, they were forbidden, demonized, woven into stories of spirits punishing the greedy. And even when the fungi didn't kill, they unsettled. Hallucinogenic mushrooms made hunters and shamans alike question whether the visions were nourishment or madness. Poison and prophecy often came from the same cap, and both were recorded as truths worth preserving. But mushrooms were only one half of the puzzle. Poison didn't just tempt on the forest floor. It crawled, squirmed, and buzzed in the air, offering food wrapped in shells and wings. Rich in protein but never without risk. Foraging has always been a form of Russian roulette, with better odds. Every new root, every fresh fungus, every insect popped between the teeth carried uncertainty. The accidental poisonings left their mark, bodies convulsing on the edge of campfires. Stories whispered about the cousin, who thought bitterness meant spicy instead of cyanide. These mistakes didn't vanish. They calcified into cultural memory, reminders etched into myth so the next generation wouldn't repeat them. Accidental deaths often became cautionary tales. In Amazonian groups, stories warned against eating certain bright-colored beetles because their fire burns inside the body. In Europe, mushroom deaths left behind proverbs about never trusting fungi with white gills. Across Oceania, tales of children chewing cycad seeds without proper soaking became ritualized warnings. Death wasn't just an ending, it was a lesson, replayed until it hardened into taboo. But the same substances that killed were also sought deliberately. Poisons blurred into medicines. Medicines blurred into ritual intoxications. A root that paralyzed in large doses might ease pain in small ones. A mushroom that warped the senses could be framed as a conversation with the gods. What terrified one generation could be a ritual for another. Shamans and spiritual specialists often walked this line intentionally. In Mesoamerica, hallucinogenic mushrooms were taken not for sustenance, but for visions. Their toxicity reframed as divine ordeal. In parts of Africa, iboga root was consumed in initiation ceremonies. Its nauseating, dangerous effects reinterpreted as necessary suffering to enter new states of being. Even in Europe, herbs laced with alkaloids, henbane, belladonna, appeared in rituals, healing charms, and witchcraft recipes, always balancing on the edge of lethality. The irony was never lost. The same dose that made you see spirits might also make you join them permanently, which meant entire communities lived with a fine sense of calibration, a knowledge of how much was transformative and how much was fatal. And when the line blurred, funerals and ceremonies followed, with the story carefully folded back into cultural instruction. Food, medicine, and poison weren't three categories. They were one spectrum, and people slid along it constantly. The body became the measuring device, the stomach the laboratory, the mind the field of experimentation. If death came, the survivors took notes, bitter ones, but necessary. And yet, while plants and fungi played the starring roles in this lethal theater, another source of nourishment, crawling, hopping, buzzing, carried its own dangers, inviting humans to crunch protein and gamble with venom, parasites, or allergic collapse. Crunching through wings and shells has been humanity's quiet survival strategy for millennia. Insects are everywhere, easy to catch, and bursting with protein, fat, and micronutrients. Termites roasted in embers, grasshoppers skewered on sticks, beetle larvae plucked from rotten logs. These were not delicacies, but daily fuel. And yet, even here, survival was never simple, because insects, like roots and mushrooms, carried their own arsenal of hidden dangers. Many insects were edible, but some were treacherous. Blister beetles, for example, contain cantharidin, a toxin so corrosive it can strip skin and burn the digestive tract. Swallow the wrong shiny little bug, and instead of nourishment, you'd get internal bleeding, the kind of mistake that turned an experimental snack into a funeral. Even termites, usually safe, could harbor parasites, passing worms or bacteria into the bodies of those who ate them raw. Allergic reactions were another invisible hazard. Long before anyone knew the word histamine, some unlucky foragers discovered their throats closed after chewing certain larvae. In communities without medical rescue, this wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a suffocating end, recorded in whispers and avoided by the next generation. But people still ate insects, and still do, because the payoff outweighed the risk. In sub-Saharan Africa, locust swarms became a bizarre feast, crops destroyed, but bellies filled with fried protein. In the Amazon, palm weevil larvae, fat and oily, became staples, rich enough to replace meat. In Southeast Asia, bamboo worms and crickets sizzled over fires, turning fields of pests into impromptu buffets. Every environment had its chosen insects, and every culture catalogued which ones offered sustenance and which ones carried poison. Cooking was often the safety net. Fire killed many parasites, smoked away bacteria, and softened exoskeletons. But fire wasn't a perfect shield. Some toxins were chemical, heat-resistant, and stubborn. Hunters and gatherers knew this instinctively. You didn't just eat any bug. You ate the ones that elders had tested, catalogued, and blessed with the quiet authority of survival knowledge. The irony is that insects were among the most reliable foods, yet they never shed the aura of danger. Perhaps because eating something that wriggled, buzzed, or oozed made people feel they were stepping into a liminal space between food and revulsion, sustenance and punishment. And maybe that unease was useful. It made people cautious, selective, aware that not every wriggling meal was safe. Still, insects taught humanity the same lesson as roots and fungi. Nothing is ever given freely. Even the smallest morsel demanded respect, knowledge, and a stomach trained not just to digest, but to gamble. And when the gamble was too high, when the risks outweighed the rewards, people learned to reshape their meals with fire, smoke, fermentation, turning toxins into calories, and survival into culinary ingenuity. The human kitchen began as a battlefield against poison. Fire wasn't just warmth or light. It was a weapon that stripped away toxins, parasites, and bitterness from roots, insects, and seeds that would otherwise kill. Boiling softened fibers, roasting neutralized pathogens, smoking extended lifespans, and fermentation transformed what was once inedible into daily staples. Cassava is the classic case. In its raw form, it can release cyanide, but soaked, ground, and fermented, it becomes farinha in Brazil, gari in West Africa, and cassava beer in Amazonian villages, all safe, all central to diets. This wasn't an accidental discovery. It was generations of experimentation, trial after dangerous trial, until ritualized labor turned poison into food. Entire economies were built on this transformation. Acorns in North America carried bitter tannins that could sicken or starve. But cracked, leached in running water for days, and dried, they became flour that sustained communities. The work was grueling, but it was also the difference between a toxic nut and bread. In Oceania, cycad seeds laced with neurotoxins demanded elaborate detoxification, grinding, washing, fermenting, repeating until they surrendered to edibility. Without patience, they caused paralysis. With patience, they became life. Insects weren't spared this treatment. Termites and locusts were roasted in pits, their shells crisped, their insides sterilized. Beetle larvae, fat and writhing, were often smoked or fried to kill hidden parasites. The act wasn't culinary flair, it was survival engineering, dressing safety in the disguise of flavor. Fermentation deserves its own place in this story. Beyond cassava, fermentation turned potentially harmful plants into staple drinks and meals. Bitter manioc became bubbling beverages. Maize in Mesoamerica transformed into pulque, and across continents, fermentation tamed toxins while offering intoxication as a bonus. It was chemistry without flasks, laboratories disguised as clay pots. These practices weren't occasional experiments. They became culture. The pounding, soaking, and smoking entered rhythm and ritual, embedding themselves in daily life. Songs, chants, and taboos were attached to them, ensuring that no one forgot the lethal consequences of skipping a step. Children learned early that laziness in food preparation could cost the entire group dearly. Cooking, smoking, and fermenting weren't luxuries, they were shields. Each act was a reminder that humans lived not by what nature provided, but by how they bent it to their will. The hearth wasn't just domestic, it was defensive. And around that fire, knowledge itself became as important as the roots or insects being cooked. Because in the end, the real protection wasn't the flame or the bubbling pot. It was a memory. Knowledge had to be preserved, repeated, enforced. A living archive of near-death experiences made edible. Every bite of food carried history. What could be eaten and what could not wasn't obvious. It was taught. Elders became living encyclopedias, storing centuries of trial and error inside stories, songs, and taboos. Their knowledge wasn't ornamental, it was the fragile thread that kept communities from collapsing under the weight of invisible poisons. Oral instruction was relentless. A grandmother could recite which mushrooms were safe and which turned the liver into pulp. An uncle demonstrated how long cassava needed to soak before the water ran clear. His scars proof of what happened when shortcuts were taken. Children weren't shielded from grisly details. On the contrary, they were reminded of relatives who had slipped, eaten too quickly, or trusted the wrong insect. Fear was education, but memory alone wasn't enough. To make lessons stick, cultures built rituals around them. In Oceania, processing toxic cycad seeds wasn't just cooking, it was framed as sacred duty, complete with chants that accompanied each stage of grinding and washing. In Africa, cassava preparation included taboos forbidding certain steps to be skipped, the penalty for disobedience imagined as divine punishment. What looked like superstition was really a safety manual written in myth. Taboo served as law. Certain plants were labeled forbidden, not because they couldn't ever be eaten, but because handling them incorrectly was too dangerous to risk. Myths warned of spirits that lived in poisonous roots or mushrooms, punishing those who disrespected them. These stories encoded chemical realities. Cyanide doesn't forgive carelessness. Alkaloids don't negotiate. Fear kept the rules alive. Even insects carried their own narrative safeguards. Brightly colored beetles were described as messengers of fire, their consumption a sin against the body. Children grew up recoiling instinctively from their shimmer, never realizing they were also dodging Canthbratin. Cultural disgust was often just survival strategy, disguised as morality. The genius of these transmissions lay in their simplicity. People didn't need to know about glycosides, alkaloids, or enzymes. They just needed to remember. Don't eat the red ones. Don't skip the soaking. Don't touch the shiny beetle. The science was buried in poetry, and the poetry carried the science safely into the next generation. But sometimes, the very same plants and insects condemned as deadly weren't entirely banished. They lingered on the edges of healing and ritual, where poison transformed into medicine, or at least into something small enough to swallow without dying. What made a root, a mushroom, or an insect deadly wasn't always the substance itself, it was the dose. The same chemicals that closed throats and silenced hearts could, in smaller amounts, numb pain, calm fevers, or unlock visions that communities treated as sacred knowledge. Poison and medicine weren't opposites, they were siblings sharing the same bloodstream. Take digitalis, derived from foxglove. Too much, and the heart stumbles into chaos. In careful hands, though, it strengthens weak pulses, turning a flower into a cardiac tool. Long before modern pharmacology confirmed it, healers knew the plant's paradox. The catch was precision. and precision in a world without scales meant experience, intuition, and sometimes, yes, a few tragic miscalculations. The same ambiguity framed psychoactive plants and fungi. The Amanita muscaria mushroom, red cap, white spots, could send a careless eater into convulsions. But in Siberia, shamans consumed it in rituals, their bodies trembling while their minds slipped into visions. What outsiders might call poisoning was reinterpreted as communication with spirits. The nausea, the sweating, the delirium, all folded into meaning, rebranded as initiation rather than accident. Insects carried their own place in this liminal zone. Blister beetles, feared for their caustic toxin cantharidin, were used in tiny doses as aphrodisiacs, and in folk medicine, the same compound that could burn holes in the gut became a stimulant. Though the line between effective and fatal was razor thin, a misstep in measurement turned desire into a death sentence. The knowledge was rarely casual. It was guarded, often restricted to healers or ritual specialists who framed their skill as spiritual authority. Only they knew how much bark to steep, how many seeds to chew, how small a slice of mushroom could open visions without closing the lungs. In truth, their expertise was inherited trial and error, smoothed into ritual, and this tension, food, poison, medicine, shaped entire cultures. Plants weren't trusted or discarded. They were negotiated with. A root could be boiled into porridge one day and brewed into medicine the next. A mushroom could be taboo for children, but holy for shamans. An insect could be forbidden for eating, but ground into powder for remedies. Every bite was a calculation. Every preparation a quiet conversation with death. It was a line walked daily, one miscalculation away from collapse. And the fact that humanity survived it at all says less about luck than about resilience, a stubbornness to turn risk into routine, to transform hazards into resources, and to treat every near-fatal experiment as a lesson worth preserving. Which brings the story to its final stage. The legacy of all this dangerous dining, how eating roots, mushrooms, and insects wasn't just desperation, but a blueprint for human adaptability. Human history is, in part, a long list of culinary near-death experiences. Every root dug from the ground, every mushroom plucked from a damp log, every insect crunched between teeth carried risk. And yet, those risks didn't extinguish us. They refined us. Trial after bitter trial, humanity turned danger into diet, poison into practice. The record is clear in how cultures endured. Cassava, once lethal, became a cornerstone of diets across continents through sheer insistence on processing it correctly. Mushrooms, so often treacherous, were catalogued, tamed, and in some cases turned into bridges to the spirit world. Insects, buzzing hazards, became protein-rich staples, from Africa to the Amazon to Southeast Asia. Every region held its own catalogue of edible versus deadly, a knowledge bank built not in libraries but in lived bodies, some buried too soon. What emerges is a pattern of resilience. Humans didn't simply accept the world's generosity. They negotiated with it, argued with it, bent it into submission. Fire, soaking, fermenting, ritual, taboo, all of these were technologies, just as essential as stone blades or spears. They made survival possible where raw nature alone would have killed, and underneath it all lay adaptability. The willingness to test, to risk, to remember. Foragers didn't have laboratories, but they had hunger and memory. And together those created a global experiment, still visible in what we eat today. Potatoes, once toxic wild tubers, became staples. Coffee and tea, laced with alkaloids, became morning rituals. Even chocolate began as a bitter, barely edible seed that cultures coaxed into pleasure. Every modern pantry is an archive of hazards overcome. The irony is sharp. Survival was never guaranteed, yet it became tradition. Death from roots, mushrooms, or insects wasn't just tragedy, it was instruction. And out of those countless experiments grew a species that didn't just endure but thrived, carrying in its recipes the memory of poisons tamed and dangers digested. In the end, the act of eating wasn't just about calories. It was about resilience, creativity, and the refusal to let the Earth's chemical defenses dictate defeat. What we now call cuisine is, at its core, the fossilized memory of risk, the elegant aftertaste of survival. For centuries, gathering has been painted as the gentle counterpart to hunting. While men supposedly went off to wrestle wild beasts, women, elders, and children stayed behind to collect roots, fruits, and greens, a pastoral image of safety and predictability. The stereotype survived so well it's still trotted out in textbooks and lazy documentaries. But the reality of gathering was closer to hazard management than leisure. Calling it safe was like calling quicksand a soft bed. Archaeological evidence shows fractures, scars, and infections on skeletons that weren't the result of animal hunts, but of everyday foraging accidents. Ethnographic studies remind us that calorie intake in many foraging societies leaned heavily on gathered food. The so-called minor work was actually the majority of the diet, which meant the risks didn't just exist, they were constant, woven into daily life. The danger wasn't always cinematic. It wasn't the dramatic chase of antelope across a savanna, but the silent threat of a poisonous berry that looked just like the edible one, or the tree branch that snapped underfoot while reaching for fruit. Fatal outcomes didn't come with fanfare. They arrived quietly, folded into the work that kept people alive. The cultural blindness to these risks says more about who recorded history than about the reality of survival. The hunter was celebrated in song, painted on cave walls, turned into myth. The gatherer was ignored, erased, or treated as background. Yet both roles balanced on the same thin line between nourishment and death. One failed spear might mean no meat that night. One misidentified route might mean paralysis. Safety was an illusion, a narrative convenience that obscured how precarious gathering truly was. And beyond illusion, the landscape itself revealed its claws, moving quietly through fields, forests, and riverbanks. Gatherers encountered predators every bit as dangerous as the ones hunters claimed as their domain. The forest edge, or the riverbank, may have looked calm, but predators weren't reading the script that said hunting was dangerous and gathering was safe. Leopards didn't care whether someone carried a spear or a basket. A person crouched down, distracted, pulling tubers from the soil was simply a convenient target. There are accounts from African forests of women attacked while digging roots or carrying bundles of firewood, their work suddenly interrupted by claws. In the Amazon, jaguars made the same argument. Quiet, camouflaged, watching from above, they struck at people bending over to collect fruits or nuts. A gatherer's posture, leaning forward, exposed, might as well have been an invitation. Predators exploited distraction. Unlike hunters who moved in groups, armed and alert, gatherers were often alone or accompanied by children. Vulnerability was part of the job description. Even rivers conspired. Crocodiles lingered where people stooped to gather water plants or shellfish, striking fast enough to drag someone under before others could react. In temperate regions, bears made berry-picking grounds hazardous, their appetites overlapping perfectly with human food needs. Foraging in berry season meant stepping into contested territory where one wrong rustle in the bushes ended with a charge. And then there were the smaller predators, snakes curled among roots, scorpions hidden in crevices, spiders lurking in bark peeled back for edible grubs. A single careless hand reaching into soil or hollow wood could result in venom delivered before there was time to retreat. These weren't dramatic hunts. They were ambushes written into the ecology of gathering. The irony is that gatherers didn't chase danger. Danger came to them. Staying close to camp, keeping two known paths, even working in daylight didn't erase the risks. In fact, it often amplified them, because predators learned the same cycles. They knew where humans bent to harvest, and they waited. But predators were only one side of the equation. The other was subtler and more insidious, plants themselves, whose defenses were chemical, invisible, and no less lethal than claws or fangs. The ground may have seemed generous, but plants didn't evolve to feed humans. They evolved to resist being eaten. Digging, picking, and chewing meant stepping into an arms race waged in sap and fiber. Cyanide, alkaloids, oxalates, these were the plant's teeth. Invisible and unblinking, waiting for whoever mistook hunger for safety. Cassava is the notorious example. Raw, it contains cyanogenic compounds that, once chewed, release cyanide. People across South America, Africa, and beyond learned to grate, soak, and ferment the tuber into something edible. Skip the steps, and the food paralyzed nervous systems or killed outright. The route was both salvation and executioner, depending on how much patience one had. Other routes carried subtler traps. Wild yams, tempting for their starch, hid alkaloids that caused hallucinations or heart irregularities. Beans contained saponins that foamed into digestive misery. Even acorns, a fallback food across continents, held tannins that in large amounts stripped the body of nutrients, leaving weakness instead of strength. None of these hazards were labeled. They were discovered through grim trial, and every community carried stories of someone who made the wrong choice. The danger extended beyond roots. Leaves with oxalate crystals shredded mouths and throats. Bright berries lured the hungry, then delivered alkaloids in doses large enough to convulse the body. The resemblance between safe and deadly species was often uncanny. One berry a cure for fever, the lookalike a shortcut to the grave. Foragers didn't get to choose whether they played this guessing game. The guessing game was survival. But plants weren't only dangerous when swallowed. Skin contact could burn or blister, as with certain nettles or vines laced with chemical irritants. Foragers pulling vines or stripping bark often carried scars, not from predators but from vegetation itself. The earth's greenery was less a buffet than a minefield, every mouthful requiring inherited knowledge, careful preparation, or blind luck. And when the food didn't bite back with poison, the act of reaching for it still carried risk. Gathering demanded climbing, bending, lifting movements that invited accidents as much as nutrition. Not every injury came with teeth or toxins. Sometimes it was gravity, clumsiness, or overwork that did the damage. Gathering demanded constant movement, bending, pulling, carrying, climbing, and each of those motions carried its own hazards. The work looked quiet compared to hunting, but the body often paid a sharper price. Take tree climbing for fruit or honey. It sounds idyllic until the bark gives way or the foot slips. Falls from height were common, and fractures recorded in prehistoric skeletons may owe as much to foraging accidents as to combat or hunting mishaps. A fall didn't just break bones, it limited mobility, and in small groups with no hospitals, immobility could spiral into death. Digging was no safer. Roots were pried loose with sharpened sticks, hands, or stone tools. It was easy to slice skin open or drive splinters deep into the flesh. Even minor cuts carried heavy risks, infections that spread quietly, unnoticed until fever set in. With no antibiotics, a scraped leg from pulling tubers could end in sepsis. The strain of carrying loads added another layer. Bundles of firewood, baskets of nuts, and sacks of tubers often weighed as much as the people hauling them. Repetitive strain, compressed spines, worn knees, these injuries carved themselves into the skeletons of gatherers. Studies of prehistoric remains show arthritis, bone deformities, and joint wear patterns consistent with years of heavy lifting. Survival meant endurance, and endurance reshaped the body. And yet, there were no breaks. Food had to be collected daily. Injuries didn't pause the need for calories. A twisted ankle still dragged itself to the berry patch, and a back stiff with strain still bent toward the soil. The labor was invisible, its cost absorbed quietly, its dangers written into scars rather than songs. But even when the body held steady, gathering was rarely solitary. Food was defended fiercely by other creatures, swarms, stings, and bites that turned the simple act of reaching into a battle. Honey might sound like the sweetest reward of gathering, but it was guarded like treasure. Climbing to a hive meant braving clouds of furious bees, each sting swelling skin, closing throats, or, in the worst cases, stopping a heart. Entire groups risked themselves for the energy-packed sugar, carrying smoldering torches to smoke the hive while still enduring dozens of stings. Foragers sometimes staggered back, swollen beyond recognition, honey in hand but body aflame. Ants were no less vicious. Leafcutter ants defended their colonies with soldier jaws sharp enough to slice skin. Fire ants left blisters that burned for days. And for gatherers scooping larvae from anthills, the experience was closer to combat than cuisine. Termite mounds, rich with edible insects, often swarmed protectively, pouring soldiers over anyone bold enough to pry them open. Scorpions and spiders hid where food grew. A hand thrust into bark to pull out larvae could come back punctured, venom racing up the arm. In tropical forests, tarantulas and smaller venomous spiders wove webs exactly where people reached for fruit. Some bites incapacitated, others killed, sudden interruptions to otherwise ordinary foraging. Shellfish gathering along coasts came with its own defenders. Razor-sharp shells, sliced feet, and hidden crabs latched on with claws that drew blood. Even mollusks carried hazards. Some harbored toxins, others contaminated with bacteria that could sicken entire groups. The sea provided, but it demanded flesh in return. What united these small creatures was persistence. Unlike predators that struck rarely, insects and defensive animals struck constantly. Their presence turned gathering into a gauntlet of stings, bites, and burns. A child's careless reach could bring days of agony, a swollen limb, or even death. The act of pulling food from nature was never uncontested. It was negotiated through pain. And beyond the direct stings and bites, there was the land itself. The environments where gatherers worked, desert heat, icy wetlands, river currents, imposed dangers as relentless as any insect swarm. Danger wasn't always crouched in the bushes or buzzing in the air. Sometimes it was the air itself, the water, the ground beneath the feet. Gathering dragged people into places where survival teetered on climate and chance. In deserts, searching for tubers or seeds meant working under a sun that stripped sweat faster than the body could replace it. Heatstroke wasn't a rare event. It was a regular tax. A gatherer crouched too long in the open risked collapse, skin blistering, lips cracked, muscles twitching. Fainting wasn't just embarrassing. It was fatal when there was no water nearby. Wetlands and rivers demanded the opposite price. Collecting shellfish or water plants meant wading into currents, bare feet sliding on hidden stones. Drowning happened quietly. One slip, one sudden current, and the body disappeared. Even shallow water could be lethal if it stunned or trapped someone beneath. The cold of northern marshes added another layer, hypothermia setting in before a basket was full. Arctic summers looked kinder with their brief burst of berries, but berry picking carried its own trap. Foragers stepped onto soft ground or thin ice while moving across tundra, plunging suddenly into freezing water. What seemed like a harmless walk turned into shock, numbness, and silence. Survival was rarely guaranteed once the cold took hold. Even mountain environments punished gatherers. Edible roots and herbs grew on cliff edges or steep slopes. Climbing for them meant gambling with gravity, arms full of plants but feet dangling over emptiness. A misstep didn't just injure, it erased. Archaeological remains found at the base of cliffs suggest that many falls weren't accidents during hunts, but during foraging trips. These environments weren't background scenery. They were active participants in survival. Each one reshaped the body and the risks, turning safe gathering into a slow endurance trial. And just as the land tested gatherers, so did other people. Because food wasn't only defended by insects, or whether it was defended by neighbors with spears. Gathering often meant stepping into contested ground. Plants didn't sprout along political borders. They sprouted wherever soil, shade, and rain allowed, which meant the roots, fruits, or shellfish that fed one group might also sustain another. Crossing into those spaces, even unknowingly, was rarely forgiven. Ethnographic records describe women attacked while gathering in disputed areas, their baskets seized as evidence of trespass. In Amazonian forests, foraging parties strayed into rival territories and faced ambushes no less lethal than warfare. A handful of palm fruits wasn't worth bloodshed in theory, but in practice, it often sparked it. For small groups, losing resources could mean starvation. Defending them was non-negotiable. Territorial disputes weren't confined to forests. On coasts, shellfish beds were prized and fiercely defended. Strangers bent over tidal flats risked confrontation, sometimes violent. Even in Arctic settings, berry patches and fishing spots carried ownership, and encroachment could ignite conflict. The risks of gathering weren't abstract. They came with sharpened tools, hostile stares, and the possibility of not returning home. Competition also existed within communities. Scarcity created tension between families, each trying to secure enough for their own children. Gossip, accusations, and open quarrels followed any hint of hoarding or unfair access. In some cases, punishment was swift, food confiscated, or individuals ostracized. Gathering might look cooperative, but beneath the surface, it carried politics as sharp as any spear. The irony is that this danger emerged, not from predators or poisons, but from the very people who shared the same vulnerabilities. Hunger sharpened boundaries. Gathering was never a neutral act. It was entangled in the politics of survival. And when violence didn't claim gatherers, slower killers often did. A scratch, a cut, a hidden parasite infections turned the smallest wounds from gathering into long, drawn-out battles against the body itself. A simple cut was never just a cut. Pulling tubers with sharpened sticks, tearing bark for edible grubs, wading through wetlands for plants, each task carried the chance of splitting skin. And in a world without antibiotics, that was more than inconvenience. It was an open door. Soil itself hid hazards. A small puncture in the foot could invite tetanus, twisting muscles into paralysis. Scratches from thorns carried bacteria that turned limbs hot, swollen, and useless. The tiniest wound, untreated, could lead to sepsis, leaving a gatherer feverish, delirious, and eventually gone. Archaeological skeletons show evidence of chronic infections, bone thickened or eaten away, the imprint of wounds that festered until death. Water didn't spare gatherers either. Collecting plants or shellfish meant immersion in rivers or swamps, alive with parasites. Schistosomes, hookworms, and flukes slipped in unseen, their damage unfolding slowly. Blood loss, weakness, organ strain. What looked like a nourishing handful of water plants often came with hidden passengers. Even fungal spores carried risks. Reaching into damp logs or moldy soil could seed lungs with infections, coughing becoming another silent consequence of foraging. The pace of these dangers was insidious. A hunter might fall in battle within minutes, but a gatherer might sicken for weeks, each day a reminder of how fragile survival was. And because gathering happened daily, wounds accumulated, blisters, splinters, abrasions, bodies bore the record of constant exposure, resilience stretched thin. And yet, gathering didn't pause. Even illness demanded food, and so the injured walked, bent, and carried anyway. The cycle of risk spun on, shaping not just health but the very rhythms of life, and woven into those rhythms was another layer of vulnerability, the weight of care. Foraging often meant carrying children, splitting attention between survival and protection, which only magnified the dangers. Gathering was rarely a solitary task. More often it was accompanied by infants bound to hips, toddlers trailing through undergrowth, or older children carrying their own small baskets. The work doubled as childcare, which meant every hazard in the landscape was magnified by distraction. A mother bent over a root, had one eye on the soil, and the other on a child poking at berries. An unexpected rustle in the bushes wasn't just a threat to her, but to the group of children she couldn't move quickly enough to protect. Predators, venomous snakes, even rival groups recognized this vulnerability. An adult, slowed by infants, strapped to her body, could neither flee nor fight effectively. Accidents multiplied under these conditions. A slip in a river was more likely when one arm held a child. Falls from trees became deadlier with an infant clinging to the back. Toddlers sampling plants at the edge of a gathering group risked poisoning themselves before an elder could intervene. Ethnographic accounts note how entire foraging trips ended in sudden emergencies because a child swallowed the wrong fruit or wandered too close to danger. The physical strain was equally relentless. Carrying food loads alongside infants meant backs bent permanently, joints wearing down faster. Bones from prehistoric women often show heavier stress markers than those of men, not because they were idle, but because they labored under double weight, resources, and offspring together. The burden of care was literally etched into skeletons. And yet, this vulnerability was not framed as weakness. It was accepted as structure. Communities adapted by embedding knowledge early. Children were taught plant identification, cautionary tales, and taboos from their first steps. Survival skills folded into play, but knowledge couldn't erase risk. It only reduced the odds. So gathering was never gentle domesticity. It was labor under constant exposure, intensified by the responsibility of protecting those least able to defend themselves. It demanded multitasking under conditions where multitasking could be fatal. And this is where the final truth emerges. Gathering was as dangerous as hunting, not in isolated moments, but in the sheer accumulation of risks, equal in intensity if not in spectacle. For centuries, the hunt has stolen the spotlight. Cave walls display charging animals pierced by spears, hunters frozen in postures of triumph. Songs and myths linger on men who faced beasts and returned bloodied but alive. Gathering, by contrast, is painted in quiet tones, figures bent over soil, baskets filling steadily, a picture of calm industry. But calm was never the truth. The truth is that gathering carried risks as sharp, as relentless, and as fatal as hunting, only without the glory. Calories tell the story better than myths do. In many forager societies, gathered foods, roots, fruits, nuts, greens, provided the majority of the daily diet. It wasn't meat that kept groups alive week after week, but the steady, dangerous work of foraging. The irony is that the task most central to survival was also the one most invisibly lethal. The risks came from every direction. Plants themselves armed with chemical traps, animals defending their territories, insects stinging in swarms, and rival groups quick to punish intrusions. Even the earth beneath gatherers turned treacherous, cliffs to climb for berries, rivers to cross for shellfish, heat to endure while digging for tubers. Injuries piled on, infections set in, and exhaustion gnawed at bodies worn down by weight and repetition. And unlike hunters, gatherers couldn't wait for the right day or the big occasion. Gathering happened daily. The dangers weren't seasonal bursts of drama, they were continuous, background threats embedded in routine. The absence of spectacle meant the absence of recognition. A hunter mauled by a boar was remembered as brave. A woman killed by a leopard while pulling firewood was remembered only by her children. Prehistoric art reflects this silence. Large animals dominate the imagery, while the quiet killer's roots, poisons, insects, accidents are invisible. Yet the graves and bones speak differently. Stress fractures, arthritis, infected wounds, all carved into the remains of those who bent and carried and climbed for food. Danger in gathering was also communal. One mistake, eating a toxic root, failing to soak seeds, overlooking a parasite, could sicken not just an individual, but an entire camp. The responsibility was immense, the margin for error non-existent. To gather was to gamble, but the dice rolled every single day. And perhaps this is why myths of safety clung so tightly, because the work demanded normalization. If every berry-picking trip were framed as life-threatening, the anxiety would paralyze. Better to pretend it was routine, safe, inevitable, even as death was woven into its edges. Safety was a narrative, not a fact. The equality of danger doesn't diminish hunting. It reframes survival as something balanced onto razor-thin edges. Hunters risked the instant, dramatic death of claws and tusks. Gatherers risked the slower, subtler deaths of poison, accident, and infection. Both roles demanded knowledge, endurance, and courage. Both carried bodies away before their time, and both, together, made survival possible. The irony is sharp. The quiet labor, erased from art and myth, bore equal weight in shaping human resilience. Gathering wasn't the softer half of subsistence. It was the hidden twin of hunting, equally dangerous, equally necessary, equally soaked in risk. The earth gave nothing freely, and both hunters and gatherers paid the same toll, only in different currencies of danger.